It is the 8th of January. You're watching Morning Live. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now, the International Court of Justice in The Hague will begin a procedure requested by the South African government to look into an alleged Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip on Thursday and Friday. Now, South Africa has requested the court's intervention to examine evidence of alleged violations by Israel of its obligation under the Convention and Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in relation to Palestinians in Gaza. Now, South Africa has defined acts of the Israeli Defense Force as genocide. Israel has meanwhile reportedly decided to appear before the court to counter the claim made by the South Africans. Now, about 22,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And to help us understand the intricacies of this case and its possible legal and political repercussions, we are now joined virtually by senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, Dr. Sithembile Mbete. Dr. Mbete, thank you so much for speaking to us. Happy New Year to you and welcome to Morning Live.
Happy New Year to you and all of your viewers. Thank you so much for having me.
A new year, but of course, some of the issues from 2023 being thrust straight into the spotlight as we start the year, with South Africa, of course, deciding for, this historic reason to bring file a case against Israel with the ICJ. So what are your thoughts on this, and also how, South Africa has decided to go about this?
Well, thanks so much for that question. Look, I think that given the kind of destruction that we have seen in Gaza since the 7th of October, and not only the high number of deaths, but also the high number of deaths of children amongst the 22,000 or so people that are confirmed to have died, around nearly 8,000 of them are reportedly children, and there are another about 9,000 people missing and about 55,000 people who've been injured in the, nearly 3 months now since the 7th of October. And all attempts using other parts of the UN system, the United Nations Security Council and the UN General Assembly, but particularly the UN Security Council, where the United States has a veto and but whose resolutions are binding on member states, they seem to have been completely unable to stop the conflict that is taking place and to stop the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. And so this measure by South Africa to go to the highest court of the United Nations to try and address this issue and stop this conflict, or to stop the violence, certainly, that is being inflicted on Gaza, I think is a commendable move by South Africa and is something that needed to be done.
Commendable, but many people would be asking to what effect ultimately? Because if we look at this is not the first time that legal procedure against Israel has been taken to the ICJ. We saw in 2004, the court rendered that advisory opinion on the case concerning the legal consequences of the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. And despite the ICJ's decision in that case that the construction of that Israeli wall was contrary to international law, Israel still didn't abide by the legal opinion. So what might the implications realistically be in this case?
Well, I think that there's 3 things that are important about this case. We know, yes, that Israel has frequently just disobeyed and ignored the advisory opinion by the ICJ, but also multiple UN Security Council resolutions. Israel has ignored them. However, I think that the first thing that's really significant about this case is that it's being brought through the Genocide Convention of 1948, which both South Africa and Israel are signatories to, and where South Africa is arguing that it has an obligation as a signatory to the Genocide Convention to prevent any other country from engaging in genocide, and also that Israel has a responsibility as a country that signed the convention to not be engaging in those actions, and that the member states generally of the United Nations, including the United States, which is supplying arms to Israel, have a responsibility to prevent such actions from taking place. So that it's being brought in terms of the Genocide Convention, which is such a significant convention of the United Nations, one of its first, and that deals with the horrific crime of genocide, I think is very important. The second thing is that the relief that South Africa is requesting, and the reason why South Africa asked for the hearings to be expedited as they're taking place on Thursday and Friday, is because they are requesting a provisional or an initial finding by the court, or that requests and that requires Israel to stop the violence that it's meting out. And so that's the very first thing that South Africa is asking for at this sort of initial stage, to say that please just let the court put out something that says that this violence needs to stop. And I think that that's really critical in terms of what I was saying earlier, that nobody else seems to be able to get the violence to stop. And that'll be very important. And if that does come from the ICJ, it'll be very difficult for a country like the United States to continue then supporting Israel with arms, because it will also then be in violation of the ICJ. And then the final thing is, even though this case is going to take many years, there's this initial relief that South Africa is seeking, but all of the other merits of the case are likely going to be discussed over and debated over a number of years, as we've seen with others. What it does is that what we've seen with the Namibia situation, Southwest Africa, where the two countries, Ethiopia and Liberia, that brought a case against South Africa for apartheid in Namibia in 1960. In 1966, the judgment to that was both Ethiopia and Liberia lost in that case. However, the UN General Assembly later on in 1966, removed the mandate or the responsibility of Namibia from South Africa. And yes, South Africa defied that for nearly 20 years after that. But what it does is that it shifts it creates a legal justification for political action in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. And reputationally, it is a serious, it damages the reputation of people who are violating the ICJ's rulings, and that is significant just in terms of international politics and perception. And yes, the effect of it may take a long time, but it's very, very important nonetheless.
And yet, there's a lot of skepticism because of some of the reasons that you have just outlined, Dr. Mbete, but also because, there's quite a lot of concern around the role of a country like the United States. They have, for example, come out saying that Israel's actions are not genocidal, and they've described South Africa's motion as meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact. Now, that was quite interesting, given a very detailed 84-page, case that was put out by South Africa. Do you think that the United States will technically be able to join Israel's counterclaim or not?
Well, I think technically they could. We've seen Malaysia as well as Turkey and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation joining, or if not formally joining South Africa's application, but certainly expressing their support for it and their endorsement of that application. And we could see similar action by other countries on behalf of Israel. So there's nothing technically that prevents the United States from doing that. However, it may not be something that the US wants to do formally, given public perception about its support for Israel, not just the international public's perception, but also the American public's perception, and the shifts that we've seen and the generational disparity in support for Israel that we've seen in the US. But secondly, as you say, South Africa's application is 84 pages. And one of the significant things about that application is that it's the only place where all of the not only the actions that have been taken by Israel in Gaza are collated and collected, but also the statements of Israeli officials saying, that are being used as to demonstrate genocidal intent. You've got all of this, all the information that we have about what's taken place since the 7th of October collected in one place and in one document. And it makes for quite damning reading. And let's remember that the Genocide Convention defines the following acts as genocide: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And arguably, at least on 3 of these 5 counts, you could categorize the actions that Israel has taken as genocide. And so these questions of interpretation are going to be really important and are a worthwhile act to be undertaking just in order to get clarity on that interpretation of Israel's actions.
Well, speaking of clarity, Israel has reportedly decided that they will counter the South African application. How significant is that, and how do you expect them to actually counter what you've said, is quite well documented application by South Africa with examples of, why they deem this to be a genocidal act on the part of the Israeli Defense Force. What could Israel possibly do to counter all of this?
Well, this is what's going to be interesting, right? Is to hear what language they use, how they respond to some of the statements of their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other members of his government, that about getting rid of Palestinians. He used the story of Amalek and that, murder every man, child, woman and child in that area, and as an analogy for what Israel intends to do in Gaza. And so to hear that response, I think, will be just very important to hear what is it that Israel says to counter. One of the things that may be an issue is whether South Africa has standing to bring this case to the ICJ in the first place. Is there a dispute the dispute is not between Israel and South Africa. However, I think that there is precedent for South Africa to bring the case forward. The Gambia brought forward a case against Myanmar in about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation because of the treatment of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. We've also seen that the court itself has opened up the basis for countries bringing cases to the ICJ, because if a country has its own obligations to fulfill in terms of international law, in this case the Genocide Convention, that can be a reason enough to give it standing to take a case to the ICJ. So we'll see whether or not Israel challenges South Africa's standing to bring the case, and whether its case is then built around that, or whether it already begins to respond to some of the substantive allegations in the South African case. And I think that the response to the substantive allegations will be really, really important, because even though as you say, people violate the rulings of the ICJ all the time, to have that publicly recorded is very significant.
We're out of time, Dr. Mbete, but just very briefly, if the ICJ rules that genocide is occurring in Gaza, what would that mean for the ICC and its prosecutors? Would this provide, for example, a strong foundation for them to pursue individuals, at least, down the track?
Well, look, the ICC, yes, would be prosecuting or pursuing individuals. I think that decision of whether the ICJ's decision, as I say, is probably 4 or 5 years away. So the two cases would be happening concurrently because the ICJ procedures do take such a long time. However, the important thing is that this provisional, this provisional request that South Africa wants to just say that the ICJ must say that this conflict must stop. And that military actions by Israel in Gaza need to stop. I think that that'll be very significant in providing a legal basis for any political action. But the broader case, I think, is going to take a very long time, and I think a lot will have happened in the world by the time that comes.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, speaking to us about the International Court of Justice beginning to look at the case that South Africa has brought, alleging that Israel and their actions in Gaza are genocidal in character. So this is where we leave that. Let us know your thoughts. It's time for your news at